The issues that Americans fight over most rarely change history, and it's not because our politicians are ignoring us, it's because we're fighting over all the wrong issues. But every few decades, the same cycle quietly reshapes our political order, whether we want it to or not. Parties shift, identities change, and the voters who can't adapt get left behind. So if you feel like your vote doesn't matter, keep watching, because the system may have already moved on without you. This cycle isn't some mysterious phenomenon. It has structure and shapes our entire order, from specific policies to voting patterns to long-term trends. Political scientists call sections of this cycle party systems, periods of history defined by new alliances and new battles. There have been 7 party systems throughout American history. In fact, you probably know most of them by the leaders that sparked the change. For the 3rd party system, it was Lincoln. In the 5th party system, it was FDR, and so on. But these leaders weren't the cause of the change, only a symptom of new forces seeking a new order. And if we know what drives these party systems, we can figure out where we're going. But before we move on, I'm going to shorten party system to PS1 and PS2 and so on for the sake of brevity. If history tells us anything, it's that people like to fight. But what's harder to understand is why we fight over what we do. Just think, why are abortion and gun rights such hot topics, while, say, the Federal Reserve Bank or the independent judicial branch are almost never brought up? The key to understanding why voters focus on the issues they do is something I call the 9 factors, a set of trackable, repeating variables that pop up in every party system. And when we apply them, they act as a sort of cipher that allow us to decode the true nature of our political order. That being said, in this video, we're going to apply the 9 factors to PS5. The year is 1930. The Great Depression is raging, people are suffering, and naturally there's quite a bit to fight about. At that time, FDR stepped onto the national stage promising sweeping expansions of federal authority to fix the crisis. His landslide victory in 1932 marked the end of decades of Republican political dominance, even though FDR's big government New Deal program found many enemies in both parties. But with the Democratic Party firmly behind the New Deal, the Republican Party was happy to take in these disowned Democrats and their small government ideas, all while FDR absorbed countless progressive Republicans eager for solutions. Thus, unconsciously, the major dividing variable changed with the new party system. Democrats became the party of a proactive government taxing and spending for the general welfare, while Republicans found themselves fighting a defensive war, championing a restrained government, one which avoids the kind of concentrated power that Roosevelt used. But this balance was always an unstable one. Republicans soon found themselves electorally obsolete, defending points the voters turned against years before. In the end, they had no choice but to embrace some of Roosevelt's ideas. The interstate system, racial integration, and the Environmental Protection Agency all owe their existence largely to Republican presidents. This trend of new ideas gradually replacing the old reveals another major point about each party system, that there is a winner and a loser. In PS5, Roosevelt's New Deal coalition simply proved too potent, and as time went on, advocates of big government simply seemed like the better choice to voters. Democrats went on a historic run, holding the White House for 20 years straight. Utterly defeated Republicans were forced to adapt, and the advocates of limited government were doomed to the sidelines. And this is where most analyses stop, but they leave out a critical detail. With the newfound dominance of pro-government forces, many experts worried that the parties were too similar, and that rampant agreement gave voters no real choices. Ironic as it sounds, the popularity of the New Deal created this very unusual problem. These eras, it's important to note, are an exception to the norm. Politics is usually a life-or-death struggle, as pioneers in the 1820s, slaves in the 1860s, and laborers in the 1930s would know well. But this period of relative peace shows us that once the revolutionary leaders' ideas win, an era of unity ensues. This unity is great for the American people and both parties, but it doesn't silence those who favor a different system. Shut out of mainstream politics, the advocates of small government were forced to seek solutions outside of the two parties. Yet these voters, ignored voters, are the most important ones of all, and our proof is found in the presidential elections of PS5. When taking a look, the South, especially the Deep South, follows a unique pattern. They begin PS5 as fanatic supporters of Roosevelt, yet the region soon drifted away from the Democrats, towards third parties and later even Republicans. The reason for this is given in the name of one of these earlier third parties, the States' Rights Democratic Party. Roosevelt's willingness to de-emphasize states' rights and the increasingly liberal nature of later Democrats chased many conservative Southerners away from their ancestral party. And when Reagan took up their cause, promising to curb the size of the federal government, they turned out in droves to support their new representative. The South's electoral revolt is just one example of a much larger rule, that factions which are sidelined in one party system often become decisive to the next. Advocates of small government were this underdog faction during PS5, and their inclusion in the next ruling coalition allowed a comeback for small government policies. Meanwhile, the dominant ideas of PS5 suddenly found themselves on the defensive against rejuvenated small government forces. But even for voters who supported a large government, this unity forced them to ask, what should the parties fight over now? For the answer, context gives us the best hint. At this time, the Cold War was peaking in intensity. This life-or-death struggle enveloped the world, with the Soviet Union swearing to destroy everything we stood for, and yet we were less sure than ever what we really believed. This national challenge demanded a national identity to define us to outsiders and unite us with allies, and this need holds the key to understanding how these cycles end, because while one issue becomes less important, another rises to take its place. Once people mostly agreed on the role of the government, the emerging battle of PS5 was over the soul of the government. In simple English, the voters moved on, but the parties didn't. And when voters are disillusioned, leaders make their biggest mistakes, because even as voters cared less and less about the size of government, political elites staked entire careers on the issue. For example, communists and socialists attracted significant attention, promising to finish what FDR started by expanding the government. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, radical opponents of large government formed the Libertarian Party in 1971, promising to shrink the government. But the voters didn't want more radical solutions, they wanted to refocus entirely, and politicians of the day found themselves at a loss. This is a key detail. When voters become disillusioned, radicalism tempts leaders. In the face of unrest, some leaders convince themselves that purity is what voters want, not relevance. Others simply recognize that a more partisan electorate is more tolerant of extremes. But near the end of PS5, this tone-deaf thinking left the field wide open for somebody with a new and relevant vision. On the other hand, a little bit of unrest usually isn't enough for a revolution. So voters put up with these problems, often for years, having little faith in their leadership or the ideas they promote. Dissatisfaction only grows, fueled by the growing radicalism of the political elite and their most loyal voters. It's clear how the failings of each group contribute to one another. This difference in values creates a vicious cycle, where disengagement breeds radicalism, which in turn breeds more disengagement. And so it's easy to see how millions of forgotten voters would abandon a system so willingly which they felt had abandoned them years before. All the system needs now is some kind of spark to light the fire. Both parties had grown stale, too fragile to adapt, and risked destroying their alliance. So what finally fixed this lose-lose situation? In the case of PS5, a better question is who fixed it, and the answer is Ronald Reagan. He ran for president in 1980 on an overtly conservative platform. This was revolutionary at the time, since conservative and liberal had always been factions within each party, but his strategy worked. But while Reagan was redefining national politics, his opponent, Jimmy Carter, tried the only strategy he knew, appealing to Democrats, whatever that meant anymore. He touted his achievements, which were significant, but he lacked the kind of vision and purpose which made Reagan so appealing. A big fat recession wasn't doing him any favors either. And this illustrates the last nail in the coffin for any dying party system. A revolutionary leader to make the implicit difference explicit. The old system was swept away along with Carter, while Reagan ushered in a new era, not because he invented conservatism, he didn't, but just because he harnessed what voters already believed. But despite transforming the electoral landscape, for years after Reagan's victory, Democrats held on to power in conservative strongholds across the South, while Republicans managed the same in northern liberal strongholds. In fact, large amounts of ideological overlap existed between the parties as late as the 2010s. Evidently, even after huge realignments, voters don't flip instantly. Their identities adjust gradually to fit political realities. Even though the Republican Party became the Conservative Party around 1980, conservatives took years to fully support their new representatives, while liberals likewise adjusted on the other side of the spectrum at the same time. But some voters feel unrepresented by these labels, leading them to reject the new order and sowing seeds for yet more change. And all of these 9 factors are more than just some cool pattern to admire. Like I said, they act like a cipher, allowing us to decode the clues that history gives us. But The application of these rules in 2026 is going to have to wait until next video. So subscribe to get notified when that comes out. If this way of looking at politics is new to you, then you should like the video, maybe share it with a friend. That would be lovely, a friend who likes to learn. Or if you just want to see these factors at work in real life, then click the video on screen, somewhere on screen. And with that, I thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye.